Hi, so it's been a while. So today, I always say that, it's always going to have been a while, but today I'm gonna be filming two videos, so you'll see me in this outfit twice. I'm gonna be filming this video right here about Lord of the Rings, and then another video I'm gonna be filming is actually a quick video about the Mask of the Red Death, because Halloween is soon. I mean, technically it's like a month and 10 days away when I'm filming this, but for me, as soon as September hits, it's gothic horror season, so it's time to read like Dracula and Poe and shit like that. It's time, and yes. So, but also I would like to talk about a very not gothic series of books called The Lord of the Rings. You ever heard of them? Obviously, everyone has. Whether or not you've read the books, you have heard of Lord of the Rings. They are a pretty much a magnum opus when it comes to the fantasy genre. In fact, they kind of define the fantasy genre. It's almost impossible to find a fantasy book these days that is not in some way influenced by Lord of the Rings. Please tell me if you can find one, because it seems kind of impossible. It is the giant mountain of the fantasy genre, I would say, just because of how influential it is. Previous to The Lord of the Rings, the fantasy genre was seen as kind of for kids, and a lot of fantasy books were sort of a escape from reality. Think of like Alice in Wonderland. Those are children's books, despite the fact that a lot of times people try to interpret the Alice in Wonderland books as being secretly dark, or as having secretly dark content, or it was about drugs, which is like a trope you find really, really common in the 60s. For example, White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. It was a big thing to be like, oh, Alice in Wonderland is about drugs. Did you know that? And I was like, she's like a young girl. I mean, maybe Lewis Carroll was on drugs. I'm not sure. He totally could have been, but I really think you don't always have to interpret things like that. If you want to, you can. But aside from that, let's keep talking about Lord of the Rings. But I could totally do a whole video on like the origins of Alice in Wonderland if you wanted me to. I think that would be interesting, or some of the influences or some of the misconceptions about those novels, because they're so interesting, but they're also kind of completely nonsensical, and that's the whole point. Feel free to disagree with that. Everyone has their own interpretation. But anyways, I want to talk about like I talked about how influential Lord of the Rings is to like the fantasy genre now, but how in fact did the Lord of the Rings, what was it influenced by? And I mean, obviously Tolkien had to get his inspiration from somewhere, so what exactly was J.R.R. Tolkien influenced by? Well, I finished reading the series for the first time this summer, and it is amazing. Like, it's totally worth the time, honestly, especially if you're into fantasy. And like I said, when it comes to the fantasy genre, Lord of the Rings is often considered basically the magnum opus. There's absolutely no avoiding references to Lord of the Rings and other Tolkien works in most of the fantasy genre at this point. It is one of the first novels to use what we would call constructed languages. For a fantasy genre, you find that in so many different series now, sci-fi and fantasy. For example, Klingon from Star Trek. These languages are made up for fiction rather than naturally occurring languages. Tolkien is so influential that sometimes I hear Welsh and I'm like, Sindarin? Oh wait, Welsh is an actual language. But anyways, I can't help but think of Sindarin, yeah. Sometimes it will even seem even a little too obvious, the influence that Tolkien has on a work, and that can happen with influences. What I'm trying to say is that Tolkien is extremely influential. This book is the question, what influenced him? You know, we talk about how influential Lord of the Rings was, but what influenced him? Well, here's a pretty obvious one. One of the most well-known influences of Tolkien was the epic Old English poem written by who knows who, we don't know, Beowulf. You can see this influence in, for example, Tolkien's use of dragons like Smaug in The Hobbit. Dragons in general were a huge trope in a lot of folklore from the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, yeah. We're not exactly sure who wrote Beowulf, and hell, we're not even completely sure of its origins as a poem. It is pretty mysterious as far as poems go. That's just how it is. I mean, you may think, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey are kind of mysterious because we don't know much about Homer, or even if Homer actually wrote those. Well, he didn't write it, but he wrote it down. But Beowulf is even more odd, we'll say. It's possible that Beowulf was composed around 700 to 750. Tolkien may have possibly based elves and orcs on similar creatures in Beowulf. For example, there are creatures in Beowulf that are directly called, like, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, I can't speak Old English, orc, knees. Tolkien was an expert in Old English literature, so Old English poems and stories were often a huge influence on his writing. The term for Ents may also have come from the Old English poem, which uses such terms as enta and or I can't pronounce it, but I'll put it on the screen. I have read the books, still can't pronounce it. We'll see. Tolkien was very inspired by old stories like this, and it seems that he wanted to create his own epic tale of mythology of England. That's interesting because there's not a lot of like English mythology, and he kind of wanted to create this, I think. Another epic poem that Tolkien was inspired by was the Finnish national poem called the, I'm gonna pronounce this also wrong, Kalevala. It's a tale that also centers a magical item, which I can't pronounce. This magical item is fought over by both evil and good forces, and it is eventually destroyed by the end of the story. There have also been parallels drawn with Arthurian legend, but apparently Tolkien denies influence from Arthurian legend, so who knows? I always thought it always kind of reminded me of some Arthurian legend, but maybe not. What are some of the influences of, say, the locations in Lord of the Rings? Well, the Shire is primarily influenced by Tolkien's beloved English countryside, and I think that one's probably fairly obvious. It was difficult to find any other clear influence for places, but it's also implied that Gondor may be inspired by the Byzantium or the Eastern Roman Empire. Rohan does also seem to be influenced possibly by like early English kingdoms, especially since the language Rohirric is meant to be a sort of Old English. Another big influence on Tolkien's work is his experience during fighting the First World War. The war in Lord of the Rings is supposed to be this war to end all wars, and that is exactly what the First and later Second World War must have felt like to live through. Also, the way Sauron make their armies in a sort of mechanical way. World War I was the first war to use this horrible modern weaponry, and that's what makes, I think, World War I so horrifying, is that it is the first time that these like European countries for a long time, which have been kind of colonizing, but I don't know how to explain it. The European countries during the 1800s were kind of off colonizing different places, and so it was a lot easier for them to win when they were fighting each other with this advanced, super like crazy weaponry at this time. It became a lot more dangerous, and it was not as easy for them to win, we'll say, which is pretty obvious. And then one of the most interesting aspects of Lord of the Rings is the fictional languages made up by J.R.R. Tolkien. And like actually a lot of times, I think it was true that the languages came first. The story for Tolkien kind of came second. He was primarily interested in creating stories for his languages rather than languages for his stories, which is what most people would do now. They would create their story, their world, but then they would create a language for those characters. Tolkien did the opposite. Tolkien loved the Finnish language and Finnish mythology, so the High Elven language of Quenya is influenced by Finnish, while the language of the dwarves is kind of inspired by like Semitic languages like Hebrew. And then Rohirric and the common tongue of Westron are inspired by English and also Old English. And then Sindarin is kind of Celtic. You can kind of tell when you look at it. Mostly Welsh, I would say. Although some of the spelling reminds me of some of the stuff I've seen in Irish, but then again, he seem to have been mostly influenced by Welsh. One of the last inspirations that I will talk about today is the obvious influence of Christianity in Tolkien's work. He was a Roman Catholic, and this both directly and indirectly influenced his work. There are usually underlying themes such as good versus evil, death and immortality, mercy versus pity, and resurrection. The connection to Christianity is even more obvious in the Silmarillion, especially in the conflict between Melkor and Eru or Iluvatar. I also recommend reading the Silmarillion if you're interested in like the backstory, but it's kind of like the in-universe like Bible of the Lord of the Rings, I think. In universes, and it sets up the entire story from the very beginning. And I mean beginning, and it is, I would say, it's an amazing story, but it's also, it's one of those books that I can only remember what's going on when I'm reading it, because I read it twice now, and it's still kind of lost on me, and I will continue to work on trying to understand it. If I take certain portions of the story out, I can remember them, but I cannot remember the thing from beginning to end because it is literally an entire history of Middle-earth, basically. In the end, all of these different sources came together to create the detailed and epic story we call The Lord of the Rings, a story which has influenced so much fantasy that it's ridiculous. What would fantasy be without Tolkien's work? Certainly, so many people wouldn't be enjoying it now, especially adults, because like I said, previously fantasy was seen as a children's genre, sort of. It was seen as a genre that basically children would read, and he kind of, and you know, The Hobbit actually kind of, or The Hobbit, yes. The Hobbit kind of exemplifies this actually, because it was in line with the earlier fantasy genres, except for the fact that there was no like, oh, it was all a dream like there is in, for example, like The Wizard of Oz, right? I think in The Wizard of Oz it's all a dream. And then same for Alice. Actually, I don't know about The Wizard of Oz. I'm not sure if I'm not sure, I can't remember, honestly. It's been a long time since I've read that. But basically, his work is just so influential and interesting as far as the fantasy genre goes, and so I wanted to do a quick video exploring what influenced his work, because his work is so influential in itself. So everything from Beowulf to different languages to Christianity all come together to influence the epic story we know as The Lord of the Rings. You know, before I read Lord of the Rings, it was kind of a daunting thing. I think it's like that for most books for me. I will be way too intimidated. I'll be like, oh no, it's gonna be hard. It's gonna be like, what? And then once I start doing it, once I get through it, it's actually not that bad. Who would have known? I think I do encourage a lot of people to read stuff that seems daunting to them, because I was like that. I've gotten into a lot of like classic literature in the past year, and it can be, wanting to get into stuff like that can be really daunting, and a lot of people really just despise having to read some of it, which I think sucks, because it's not meant, and I know some people will go around making it seem as if it's like super easy to read this stuff. Trust me, it's not. It is not, okay? It is not. A lot of times, especially with classic stuff, you are going to have to like read certain chapters multiple times. You'll have to look up the spark notes to make sure you understand what's going on, because I've had to do that. I definitely had to do that with a lot of the books I've read. I've had to like make sure I understand everything, understand the context in which it was written, especially if it's a historical work, like the Divine Comedy, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, anything like that. If it's like a older historical work, you're gonna want to know the context in which it was written and why people act the way they do. Even like newer works like Lord of the Rings is technically a bit of a newer work as far as that goes, can seem daunting, but I would say just like take your time. If you don't understand something, it's okay to look it up. I think a lot of people are scared of reading because the way English class teaches it, especially Shakespeare. This is a little rant I'm going on, especially Shakespeare. It kind of frustrates me the way they teach Shakespeare. They teach it in a way that does not really always let you work with the characters. In my opinion, I think watching stuff like Shakespeare acted out, so like watch a version of it that's a play. I mean, teenagers are gonna connect with that, or maybe even a movie adaptation, way easier, especially when it's visualized, or at least have them act it out. Don't like just make them read it directly from the text with no character in your voice. It really turns people off to stories that are actually really good. So peace, that's it. That's all I wanted to talk about right now. Thank you.